Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the Frontiers of Parameterized Complexity, and I'm very delighted to announce our next speaker, Edith Elkind. Please, Edith.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be giving this talk. So that's my third talk on Zoom. I'm still not used to the format, but I'll try to do my best. So I know that some of my co-authors on this paper are here. At least I've seen Niclas and Robert. So I hope that they will be able to answer questions in the chat as they appear, and I'll be checking the chat occasionally as well. But mostly I'll try to just get on with my talk and not follow the chat too much. Okay, so this isn't a standard parameterized complexity talk. So this is a talk about a series of papers on a collision formation problem, a class of games that we call hedonic diversity games. And the reason I chose to present it is that I hope that some of the questions that we were not able to solve, some people in this community will be able to solve. Make sense? Okay, so the title is Hedonic Diversity Games. So my co-authors on this series of papers are Niclas Boehmer, who was a master's student at Oxford last summer when he did this work, and is now a PhD student at TU Berlin with Rolf Niedermeyer. Hi, Niclas. Robert Vedrak, who is kind of in a research and teaching position at TU Berlin, and Ayumi Karashi, who used to be my PhD student. So here's a picture of Ayumi, kind of eventually graduated from Oxford, and who now has a faculty position in Tokyo. Okay, let me start with So for a moment, my laptop refused to cooperate, but now it seems working again. Let me start with a motivating example. So imagine that a university far, far away, in much better times before the new normal, when students could still travel, there was a group of 20 visiting students who, alongside with 80 local students, were taking the algorithms class. So let's say that local students were British and the visiting students were from France, native speakers of French. And for that course, so imagine that students have to split into study groups of size, let's say between 1 and 6. So these study groups will maybe work on programming assignments, discuss problem sets, kind of prepare solutions to homework problems together, and generally kind of collaborate on their course material. Okay, and now the students have to decide how to form these study groups and what are the principles they want to follow when forming these groups. So let's think what may be going through their heads. So we may have visiting student Claire who says, well, here's an exchange student. The main reason I came here is that I want to practice my English. So I want to be in a group with no French students where I'm forced to speak English. Right? That's a legitimate position. Well, we have another visiting student, let's say Nicolas, who says, well, my English is not great. I want to be in an evenly mixed group so that if I have an idea and I can't really communicate it in English, maybe a fellow French speaker can help me explain what I mean. Right, and then we have also local students. And you can easily imagine that some local students may be saying, well, I don't want this trouble of foreign students who don't speak proper English. I will not learn anything in a mixed group. I don't want to be in a group like that. Right, and maybe I have another local student, Jen, who says, I want to meet new people, so I want to be in a group with as many visiting students as possible. Right, it makes it more fun. Okay, so the question I want to ask now, note that all these preferences are not about individuals, they're preferences about the ratio of French speakers and English speakers in a group. So what we want to do in this situation is we want to split students into groups in a way that respects these preferences. Right, in a way that respects the preference, makes students happy, and make the resulting partition stable. And the question then, can we do that? Okay, so let me first introduce the formal model, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about the notions of stability we want to consider in this setting. Okay, so in our formal model, there's a set of players N, and the players are divided into two types. Each player is either red or blue. So the set of players consists of red players plus blue players. And the outcome is partition of N into subsets of players that are called collisions. Now players have preference over possible collisions. Right? And the preferences are formulated in terms of the ratios of red to blue players. So let's say for convenience that each player has a preference over the fraction of red players in her group. Right, so that means in particular that if I'm a red player, I'm equally happy in a group that has me and 2 blue players, like here, versus a group that has me, another red player, and 4 blue players, because the ratio is the same, 2 to 1, versus a group that has me, 4 other red players, and 10 blue players. Right, so I care not about absolute numbers, but about ratios. Right, so note that this, one advantage of this representation is that it's succinct. Right, so what the domain of all preferences is the set of ratios, kind of possible ratios between red and blue, possible ratios between red players versus group size within the collision. Right, so in general, if I'm talking about preference over collisions, so I have this trouble that potentially I'm talking about preferences over an exponentially large number of groups, but not in this setting, right? When I just have 2 player types and I only care about fractions, it suffices to express my preferences over ratios, right? So the numerator here would be the number of red players in a group. The denominator here would be the overall number of players in the group, right? And as long as I have preference over these numbers, it induces preferences over collisions. Okay, so one natural special case in this setting, and you'll see why it's significant later on, but let me now just try to argue why it's natural, is the case of single peak preferences. So what do single preferences mean in this setting? So some of you may have seen this concept in the context of voting, but it also makes sense in the collision formation scenario. Okay, so what do single peak preferences mean? Well, we say that each player has a preferred ratio of red to blue players, right? The most preferred ratio ever. Right, and they evaluate other ratios depending on how close they are to this theta I. Right, so in particular, if my preferred ratio is theta I, and I'm looking at 2 possible collisions, one with ratio theta, and the other one with ratio theta prime, and theta prime is closer to theta I than theta is, then I'm going to favor theta prime over theta, because it's more similar to my most preferred ratio. Right, and the same for 2 ratios that are both greater than theta I. Right, if theta I is my top choice, theta prime is just slightly bigger and theta is even bigger, I'm going to prefer again theta prime over theta I. Right, so I have a preferred point and my preferences decline in both directions from that point. So in that sense, my preference have a single peak at theta I and decline from there. Okay, so that's the formal model. That's how I present my game. So now let me talk about what it means for an outcome to be stable. So there are several notions of stability that are traditionally considered in the context of collision formation games. I'm going to focus on one of them in most of the technical part of the talk, but I'm going to introduce all 3 that are most commonly studied. So the simplest notion is what is called Nash stability. Nash stability is the notion of stability when no agent wants to move to another group. So say we have these 2 groups, this 3-player group and this larger group of however many, 7 players, right? So we say that an outcome is Nash stable if no player from this group wants to move to that group, right? And that holds for every single player. There is no player who wants to move from their group to some other existing group. Okay, that's the simplest notion of stability, the single player deviations. Individual stability is kind of like Nash stability, but it allows the players in the group you are joining to veto you. Right? So here we say, well, this player may consider deviating to this collision on the right, but for her to do that, she must receive an approval from all members of this collision. So if she wants to join this bigger collision, she must ask this lady if that's okay, right? And that lady should say, yes, that's okay. I like the collision including you at least as much as I like the original collision. This man should say the same. So everyone in this collision should be as happy with the collision including this lady as they were with the original collision, at least as happy. Right? So that's called individual stability. Right? So both Nash stability and individual stability talk about deviations by a single player. So we can also talk about deviations by groups, deviation by collisions. Right? And this is called core stability. No group wants to move. So we take 2 collisions here, and we say that a group of players have a deviation, like these 2 ladies, if they can form a new collision, this one, which both of them strictly prefer to the original collision. Right? So this lady with the bag prefers to be in a collision with pink lady to her original collision of size 3. And similarly, the pink lady prefers the collision with lady with a bag to her original collision. Right? And if there is no such deviation, then the outcome is called core stable. Okay, so to sum up, Nash stability, deviations by single player, no approval, individual stability, deviation by single player, but requires approval, and core stability, group deviation. Right, so this would be the notions of deviation we're going to look at. Okay, so our model, we call it diversity games. So the reason why we call it diversity games, perhaps I should have explained it earlier, right, is that in our model, players are divided into types, right, and they have preferences over how diverse their collision should be, right, and it's not the case like in many other related models. So for instance, the model of related model of shelling games comes to mind, or so there's kind of similar model studied in other settings, but the models where players prefer to be with players who are like them. So the way we deviate from that is we say, well, there are two types of players. Players care about the ratios of both types in their collision, but they don't necessarily prefer collisions with more players like them, right? So they don't necessarily have a preference for homogeneity, right? So they may have the opposite preferences. They may prefer a collision with players of mostly the opposite type, or they may prefer mostly mixed collision. Okay, so players have different preference over how diverse their collision should be. So there's a model that has somewhat different motivation, but turns out to be very similar on a technical level. Right, so let me say a few words about it first to set up the scene for what I'm going to talk about next. Okay, and this is the model of anonymous games. So it's fairly old, so it goes back almost 20 years, back to a paper by Gamolna and Jackson. Right, and it's also a model of collision formation. So we have a set of players who need to form groups, right? But now agents have preferences over the size of their group, right? So there are no types. All players are assumed to be the same, right? And what you care about is the size of the group you're in, right? So some people prefer to be in a group of size 2 to a group of size 3. Some people prefer a group of size 5 to every other group size, etc. Right, so this is again succinct. Preferences are defined on possible collision sizes, right? And here you can also define single peak preferences, right? The single peak preference in this case simply means that each player has a preferred size Si, right? And the way they compare two sizes is according to the distance from their preferred size, right? So if I'm looking at two group sizes, S prime and S, and say both are smaller than Si and S prime is slightly bigger, then I prefer S prime. Or if both are bigger than Si and S prime is smaller, then again I prefer S prime. Right, so I prefer sizes that are closer to my preferred size. Okay, so I think there are some questions here, but I think they're all questions about definitions of stability, and my co-authors are handling them perfectly, correct? Should I intervene? Is there any need for me to intervene? No, I don't think so, right? Okay, so there's a question about, let me look at the chat, about sizes. If my preferred size is 7, is it possible that I like 1 more than 8? Yes, right, so in the definition, so good question, thanks for mentioning this. In the definition of single peak preferences, we say how players compare two sizes that are both to the left of the preferred size, both to the left of Si, and how they compare two sizes that are both to the right of Si. But we are agnostic on how they compare two sizes that are on different sides of the preferred size. Yeah, so you may like 1 more than 8, and you may like 8 more than 1. Right, so I make no assumptions there. Right, so if I try to graph the strengths of my preference, it has a single peak at Si, but it declines in both directions, but it may decline at different speeds. Right, and I also allow indifferences in my preferences. I may have 7 as my preferred size, but 8 may be equally preferred. So I may have this little plateau on top. I'm indifferent between 7, 8, and 9. Okay, makes sense so far? Okay, so that was the model of anonymous games, right? And this is a model that turns out to be very similar at a technical level, and we were able to inherit some results from that, but that also confused us in a way that is interesting and that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so let me first tell you what is known about anonymous games. Okay. So I talked about three notions of stability. So core stability was the one about group deviations, right? And therefore anonymous games are bad news. So core stable outcomes may fail to exist. So that was shown in the original paper. There was a paper a couple of years later showing that they can be NP hard to find. Nash stability, similar story. The original paper shows that they may fail to exist, and that's actually very easy to see. And there was a follow-up paper, same paper by Ballister, showing they're hard to find. Okay, let me explain first why they may fail to exist, right? So that's a very simple argument. Say we have two players. We can call them, if you'd like, pursuer and vader, right? So the first player, this guy, likes to be alone. So his preferred collision size is 1. This player likes to be in a collision of size 2, right? So what can happen? If we keep them alone, if we keep them in 2 singleton collisions, then the pursuer would want to join the other player, right? Because she prefers collision of size 2 to collision of size 1, right? So having them in singletons is not stable. So what about having them together? Well, then the vader guy says, well, no, I'd rather be alone than in a collision of size 2, so let me go away. So that's not stable. Right, so that shows immediately that Nash stable outcomes may fail to exist. Right, and it's a very simple example. So whatever additional assumptions you'd like to make about players' preferences, I'm pretty sure that that example would survive. So Nash stable outcomes generally fail to exist even under various reasonable constraints on preferences. Okay, and now for individually stable. Okay, so that like I said, they can be hard to find. Right, and now individually stable outcomes. Right, so here the notion of stability is you can only deviate if everyone in the collision you join doesn't mind. Okay, so here the story is kind of the same. They may fail to exist and can be NP hard to find, but with a twist. They always exist and they can also be found in polynomial time if the agent's preference is single peak. Right, so if every agent has a preferred collision size and their preference decline in both directions on that size. Okay, so interestingly, right, so it's not an attempt to overcome NP hardness from 2004, because as you can see, this is a result of the original paper. So it wasn't phrased as a polynomial time algorithm, but it was a constructive proof. And if you look at that proof, you can actually extract a polynomial time algorithm from that proof. Okay, so that suggests that single peak preferences, at least in the context of anonymous games, kind of generally are useful for getting positive results. Right, and that was one of our inspirations when we tried to see what happens for various stability notions in diversity games. Okay, so now let me give you a quick summary of our complexity results here. Okay, Nash stable outcomes. So what I'm talking about is actually not a single paper, but a series of papers. Again, should have mentioned it earlier, apologies. So the first paper was with Robert Bredek and Ayumi Igarashi, and it was published in AMOS 19. Right, and then there were 2 follow-up papers. So both were based on the master's thesis of Niclas Boehmer when he did his master's work with me last summer. Okay, so the first paper, which introduced the model, showed that Nash stable outcomes may fail to exist. And it's kind of the same model from the previous, it's kind of the same example from the previous slide, except now it has colors. Right, so let's say that the red agent prefers, again, we have 2 agents. Red agent prefers homogeneous collisions, right? So he'd rather be in a purely red collision than in mixed collision, right? And blue player prefers mixed collisions. Blue player prefers a collision that is equally mixed to purely blue collision, right? And you can see that we effectively reconstruct the argument from the previous slide. Kind of the red player prefers to be left alone, right? And the blue player always wants to join him, right? So we can't have Nash stability. Right, and then one of the first results in Niclas's thesis is that Nash stable outcomes can be NP hard to find. Right, and that in effect is an adaptation of the argument from the anonymous games paper. Right, so it takes a little bit of work to establish it, but it's not particularly surprising. Okay, so now for individually stable outcomes, here is where we have an interesting story. Right, for individually stable outcomes, it turns out that we have a strong positive results here. They always exist, and moreover can be found in polynomial time. So the story is as follows. So in the first paper, in the paper with Robert and Ayumi, are inspired by the result for anonymous games. We looked at the setting of single peak preferences, and we came up with an argument that works specifically for players with single peak preferences. The original argument from the anonymous games paper from Bogamolna and Jackson was fairly complicated, and our algorithm, well, was not an easy adaptation of the algorithm. It's kind of similar in spirit, but it took quite a few different ideas. And I think it was something like 5 or 6 pages of the original Amos paper describing the algorithm and proving its correctness. So we were very, okay, let me speak for myself, but I was certainly very impressed with this result. I think my co-authors were also very impressed with what we did. Right, and we left it as an open question, what happens for general preferences? And we kind of suspected that there's a non-existence result there, and possibly a hardness result there, but we didn't manage to get any counterexamples. Okay, so then Niclas came, right, and I suggested that he may want to explore this topic for his master's thesis, right, and generally topics around hedonic diversity games. And after a couple of weeks, he approached me and told me that, well, he thinks there's actually an algorithm that works not just for single peak preferences, but for general preferences. And embarrassingly, this algorithm is also much simpler than our algorithm for single peak preferences. In fact, it's so simple that I will be able to describe it to you in full generality and together with a proof of correctness in the next few slides. And this is what I'm going to talk next. Before I get into that, let me also summarize what we have for core stability. And for core stability, the results are kind of like for anonymous games. Core stable outcomes may fail to exist, and they can be NP hard to find, and that's a result from the original paper with Robert and Ione. Okay, so now the positive result for individual stability. So let me give you the algorithm. So first, I need a simple definition. So let me say that a player, a red player or blue player, is nice if this player prefers to be in a mixed pair, evenly mixed pair, to a singleton collision, or in other words, to a collision that consists of players exclusively of his color. Okay, so that's the definition of nice. So here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to order my red players here and my blue players here, and I'm going to mark where the nice players are. Right, so here I have 2 nice red players, and I have 4 nice blue players. So in the first step of my algorithm, I'm going to form a maximum balanced collision of nice players. Right, so in this case, since I have 2 red nice players and 4 blue nice players, all I can do is to take 2 of each kind. So as a result, I'll have some leftover nice blue players, but I won't have any leftover nice red players. Right, and in general, no matter how you do it, you'll exhaust all nice players of one color, but you'll possibly have leftover nice players of the other color. Okay, so this is going to be my base collision. At this point, it consists of nice players only, and it's perfectly balanced. Right, so note in particular that they're perfectly happy to be in that collision. It's at least as good for them as being alone because they're nice. Okay, and next I'm going to go through the remaining players and ask them if they have an IS deviation to this collision C. Right, so what I'm asking them more precisely is not just whether they want to deviate, but I'm also asking kind of if players who are currently in collision C are willing to accept them. Right, so let me take this red player. She says, well, I'm not a nice player. I don't care for evenly balanced collision, but this 3-to-2 ratio is something that I prefer to be in alone. So I'd like to be in this collision. Right, and all these nice players, so actually it turns out that they're at least as happy with 3 red, 2 blue as they with evenly mixed. So they allow the red player to join. Right, and then there may be another red player who also prefers this collision to being alone, and everyone else doesn't mind, so she's allowed to join. Okay, and then maybe one of the blue players will be able to join the new collision. Right, and again, everyone in the collision doesn't mind. Okay, so now here's a question to check your understanding here, so I hope to see some feedback in the chat. Let's look at this player. Can he join the collision at this point? Right, so here's why I'm asking. This is a nice player. If he were to join the collision now, it would be an evenly balanced collision, right? And he's at least as happy with an evenly balanced collision as being alone. So he would want to join, but can he join? Yes, no? Any opinions in the chat? I could start a vote, but I think it's too much hassle, so let me just wait for someone saying something in the chat. No. Yes, exactly. Thanks. Yes, so this is not going to happen because we already have these non-nice players in the coalition and they would veto him, right? So this blue guy wants to join to form a equally balanced coalition, but this red guy is sitting here. The red guy is happy with where they are, prefers this to a singleton, right? But if this blue guy were to join, it would be a balanced coalition, and we know that red guy prefers being alone to the mixed coalition, so he definitely prefers the current coalition to the blue guy joining. Right, so this blue guy won't be able to join. Okay, and so now when the players who are left outside of the big coalition run out of IS deviations, we stop and we declare that to be the partition. So we output this big coalition, right, that was initially balanced and then grew possibly to be unbalanced, and we have a bunch of singletons, so we output them as being in singleton coalitions. Okay, so my claim is that this is actually an individually stable outcome. And let me try to argue that by looking at three groups of players. My three groups of players are going to be singleton players left outside of the big coalition, players in the big coalition who are nice, and players in the big coalition who are not nice, who joined in subsequent steps. So let me go through them in order. So let me start with singletons who are left outside of the big coalition. So what sort of deviations can they possibly have? Well, they can potentially deviate to the big coalition, but we actually know that this isn't possible by our stopping criterion. If they had an IS deviation to the big coalition, they would be allowed to do it, so they don't have such a deviation. Short of that, what they can do is they can form coalitions among each other, so they can form coalitions with other singletons. So maybe, okay, so in this picture I just have one red player, but potentially red players could form coalitions among themselves, except that would be stupid, right? So they're indifferent between being alone and being in a coalition with other red players, right? So we can rule that out. So the other thing that they can do is they can form a two-color coalition. A red player from here and the blue color from here can try to form a coalition. Okay, can it happen? Well, not in this case, right? So in this case, we know that the red player doesn't want to join B because the red player is not nice, right? So the blue player may want to join red, but then the red player wouldn't allow it because the red player is not nice. Okay, so that's in this specific case when we don't have any nice red players, but this is true in general because like I said before, for at least one color, we are not going to have nice players of that color. And to form a two-color coalition, it would take two nice players, right? Because you can only form a pair consisting of a red agent and a blue agent if both agents in that pair would prefer that pair to being alone, which means that both of them would have to be nice, right? And for at least one color, all nice players of that color already sit in that big coalition, right? They went into that big coalition at the very first step, right? So in our case, R doesn't want to join B, and B is not allowed to join R for the same reason, namely because R is not nice, right? So there's nothing that singleton players can do on their own. Okay, so the argument for other player types is not very different. So let's look at the nice players. What can they do? They're sitting in the big coalition already, so they can deviate by leaving that big coalition. What can they do if they leave the big coalition? They can go away and be alone, or equivalently join other players of that same color. Well, not, okay, so why is that not going to happen? Well, in the beginning, they formed this coalition because they were nice. They preferred being in that evenly balanced coalition to being alone, right? At least as happy as being alone. And crucially, after that, some other players joined the coalition, and maybe now it's not evenly balanced, but these players, each time they were asked to approve the change, and each time they approved. Each time they said, well, the new coalition is at least as good as what it was before. So by induction, it means that at each step in the process, they like the coalition C at least as much as the initial evenly balanced coalition, right? So they weakly prefer coalition C to an evenly balanced coalition, and they weakly prefer evenly balanced coalition to being alone, so they don't want to deviate. So they don't want to deviate to being alone, and sort of by the same argument, they could want to deviate to a mixed pair, right? So this red guy can deviate and form a mixed pair with blue, right? And that would give them an evenly balanced collision. But again, we have argued that they prefer C to an evenly balanced collision because they approved all change into C, right? So they started with evenly balanced, and the current collision is at least as good as evenly balanced, right? So R prefers C to a mixed pair. R weakly prefers a mixed pair to being alone, so means R weakly prefers C to whatever she can achieve by deviating, right? And the same for B, right? Each nice player weakly prefers the current state of affairs to being alone or to a mixed pair. Okay, slightly more subtle argument for players who joined the big collision later in the game. Okay, so what about them? So non-nice players in collision C. So let's look at player R. So R joined. She joined because she preferred the collision C as it was at that point to being alone, right? So that was the whole reason why she joined. Right? And she approved all subsequent changes to the collision again, right? And this means that she weakly prefers this collision to being alone. Wonderful. So this means she doesn't want to deviate to being alone. Why is it that she doesn't want to deviate to a mixed pair? Well, we are talking now about non-nice players, right? So we are talking about players who joined later, right? So these are exactly non-nice players, right? And non-nice players prefer being alone to a mixed pair. Now, we already argued that this player, R, prefers the current collision to being alone, and we know that R prefers being alone to a mixed pair. So by transitivity, R doesn't want to deviate to forming a mixed pair with one of these cards, right? So again, no deviation for R. Right, and this argument applies both to red players and to blue players because both of them are non-nice. Okay, so that concludes the proof, 3 out of 3, and that's the proof of individual stability. Okay, and that's entirely by Niclas. Okay, so that's what I wanted to tell you about individual stability. And I think for individual stability, okay, so I'll come back to that a little bit later with a justification of why our algorithm for single peak preferences is still useful. So the story has a twist. But before I go there, so let me talk a little bit about the other two solution concepts, Nash stability and core stability. And let me tell you what we did in search of positive results there, because this is something that I think this community really wants to get from this talk, right? So where are the open problems and what may be interesting here algorithmically and in particular from the parameterized complexity perspective. Okay, so what are the potential easy cases? Okay, so let me tell you what we have. Okay, so what are natural special cases to consider in this setting? Well, you can say, well, okay, so suppose players just have dichotomous preferences. They approve some factions and they disapprove other factions, right? So there are good ratios of blue to red and there are bad ratios of blue to red. Okay, under this assumption, can we guarantee Nash stability? No. So our original two-player example shows that, but maybe things become computationally easy. Well, no such luck. We still get NP hardness. Okay, so let's specialize it a little bit further. So again, we have dichotomous preferences, approval, disapprovals, but now let's say that each agent approves at most S ratios, right? So there's just some small number of ratios of red and blue that I consider good and everything else is bad. Right, and maybe for small values of S, I can get positive results. Right, so that was our hope. Well, no. So in our paper with Niclas, so we show that there's a hardness result even for a constant value of S equals 4. So subsequently, Andreas Darman sent us a proof where he improved this result to S equals to 2. So very impressive argument. But the real interesting case is S equal 1, and this is still open. Right, so S equals 1 means simply that I have one desired proportion between red and blue pairs, right? And everything else is just not good. So there's one that is good and everything else that is not good, right? And it seems plausible that in this case, so it may be possible to get polynomial-time algorithm, and we spent quite some effort on it, and we don't know how to do it, right? So this is, I think, a really nice open problem. And let me just mention that in the paper with Niclas, we show that kind of the same question for anonymous games is actually easy, right? So for anonymous games, where each player just approves exactly one collision size, so we can decide in polynomial time if there's a Nash stable outcome. But extending this result to extending this out to diversity games just seems to fit. Okay, so what is another destination to look for easiness results? So we can ask about strict preferences. Say no agent is indifferent between two ratios. So there's still a hardness result for that case, right? So that's not helping. Single peak preferences, right? So introducing, I mentioned single peak preferences because they seem to be helpful for anonymous games. And initially they seemed helpful for diversity games as well, at least for individual stability. So for Nash stability, this is something that is open. So we don't know if there's a polynomial-time algorithm for Nash stability for single peak preferences. There's no guarantee of existence, but maybe there's an algorithm and we simply don't know. Okay, so this is mostly about us failing to get positive results. Well, this is our, well, one little positive result, probably not very impressive. It's kind of parameterized result, but it's XP rather than FPT, and we don't have a matching parameterized lower bound. But well, this is what we have. Okay, so suppose we have very few players of some type. So let's say P is a minimum of the number of red players and the number of blue players. Then there's a polynomial-time algorithm for deciding whether there's a Nash stable partition whose running time scales like NP to the power P times poly n. Right, so XP rather than P. So takes, well, some combinatorial cleverness, but kind of not super hard. So we tried a bit to improve it to FPT, we didn't succeed, and we don't have a matching hardness result. Right, so this seems like a promising direction to explore. Okay, so that's Nash stability. Okay, so let me try to do the same for core stability, where we have even less in the way of positive results. Okay, strict preferences, so the hardness result survives. For dichotomous preferences, I believe it's still open. Single peak preferences, for sure it's open. Okay, so you can ask, so the question we asked in the previous slide, so very few players of some type, right? So this is the setting where we had a XP result for Nash stability. So for core stability, we don't even have that. We have a positive result for P equals 1, meaning we have just one red player and a bunch of blue players, right? And the core is non-empty and an outcome in the core can be found in polytime. So embarrassingly, we don't even have an answer for P equals 2. So nothing is known beyond P equals 1. Okay, so another direction to explore, another reasonable parameter that has been used in related settings is when agents have similar preferences, right? So for instance, here's what we can show. Suppose all agents, both red and blue, they have the same preferences over ratios, right? So they all think that there's a perfect ratio between red and blue, right? Then the core is non-empty, right? And an outcome in the core can be found in polynomial-time. So you can hope to extend it by saying, well, maybe there are two types of agents with respect to their preferences. There are some agents have one ranking. All remaining agents have some other ranking. Right? So we just have two different rankings among the agents. Can we have some positive results in that setting? Well, we don't know. So we suspect that there may be some positive result there, but we don't know. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about the extensions of the basic model. So I started this talk by discussing the setting with players of two types. So visiting students at a British university, so French speakers and English speakers. Right? And of course, there is no particular reason why kind of this whole model of diversity games should be limited to two types. So you can ask what happens if in addition to French visiting students, we also have Italian visiting students. Right? So instead of two colors, red and blue, so we have three colors, red, green, and blue, or just whatever, fixed number of colors. So then the first question you need to ask is how you even define diversity for that setting. Right? And there are two reasonable answers. So one kind of very general model is to set red player cares about all possible ratios. So as a red player, I care about proportion of red versus blue. I care about the proportion of red versus green. And I also care about the ratio of green versus blue. Right? So in particular, it's important to me what is the ratio between the other types in my collection. And the other model is, as a red player, I only care about the fact collection of red players in my collection. Right? So kind of to illustrate the difference between these two models, let's look at these two collisions. So in the first model, this red player is potentially not indifferent between these two collisions. They look different to him, right? Because in this collision, he has both blue neighbor and green neighbor, and here he only has green neighbors, right? So these two are different. Whereas in the second model, these two collisions would be identical for the red player, because in both of them, there is one red player out of 3 players altogether. Okay, so this model is more expressive, this model is more succinct, and arguably still captures interesting properties. Right? So you can argue that for a French student in a group of students who study together, it only matters what is the fraction of French students, and the ratio between Italian students and local British students doesn't matter. Okay, so what can we hope to prove in this more general model? So I would argue that, okay, so I see a question here, so let me, what R and G and R to B decide the value of G to B? Yes, so this is badly stated. Yes, so what I meant is, okay, so if you know both of these ratios, okay, so this is sort of superficial. So if you care about this one and you care about this one, of course, you know this one. Yeah, so the distinction I wanted to make was between this case, where you only care about R versus total, and the one where you separately care about R versus B and R versus G. Thanks. Okay, so what can we hope to prove in this more general model? Well, we have hardness and non-existence results for Nash stability. We have hardness and non-existence results for core stability, but we can sort of hope that positive results for individual stability maybe extend beyond 2 player types. Okay, is that true? Well, for the first model, so we get non-existence immediately, non-existence of individually stable outcome with even just 3 types, red, blue, and green. Right, and it's an easy adaptation of kind of some known kind of non-existence results from other. Right, and we get computational hardness for at least 5 types. Okay, so even for small constant number of types, so there are some gaps here, obviously, right? So we don't know what happens for 4 types, for 3 types, right? So computational hardness for 3 and 4 types is something that we don't have, right? So it's plausible that these are still hard, but we just don't have proofs. Okay, so for the second model, which is less expressive, so there's more hope for positive results, but what we can show in that model is that it actually subsumes anonymous games. So you can encode anonymous games kind of in this model. Sorry. You can encode anonymous games in this model. And in anonymous games, non-single picked anonymous games, an individually stable outcome may fail to exist. So we get non-existence here, and we also get hardness. So the caveat here is the non-existence result for anonymous games holds for a largish value of players, and that translates into a largish value of colors here. So we have a non-existence result here starting with something like 42 players. So we don't quite know what happens when starting with 42 colors. So we don't quite know what happens for 3 colors and 4 colors, right? So it's still entirely plausible that with 3 colors, individually stable outcomes in the second model always exist, but we just don't have proofs. Okay, so there are some kind of open questions here as well. Okay, so now let me talk about some empirical results that Niclas also had in his thesis, because interestingly, they vindicate the algorithm, the long and complicated algorithm from the original paper with Robert and Ayumi. So something that is really natural to ask in this context, both theoretically and empirically, is what would happen to players if they are left to their own devices, right? So the stable outcomes are defined in terms of deviations. So what if we start with some initial partition of the agents and just let them deviate according to the rules of the game? So if we talk about Nash stability, we allow agents to deviate without asking approval. If we talk about individual stability, we allow agents to deviate as long as they have the approval of the collision that they're trying to join. Right, so we can ask, okay, so let's look at this process where players kind of deviate one by one in whatever order. Is it guaranteed to converge? Okay, so in particular, so let's ask this So for Nash stability, I mean, we already know that equilibrium may fail to exist. So let's ask this question for individual stability. Right, so this is called better response dynamics. So the way we formulate, if some player has an IS deviation, let her perform it. Right, and the question you want to ask, does this always converge to an IS outcome? Right, we know that an IS outcome necessarily exists, right, but it doesn't mean that this particular dynamics would necessarily converge. Right, so dynamics may cycle potentially, even if there is some individually stable. Right, so there are some settings where every best response dynamic generally in game theory, there are settings where every best response dynamics converges to a stable outcome, right? So these are attractive models, right? But it may be the case that a stable outcome exists, but the dynamics is not guaranteed to converge. So which is the case for hedonic diversity games, right? Well, we were not so unfortunately, this is something that we were not able to establish theoretically, but we tried to do it empirically. And empirically, it seems that best response dynamics always converges to individually stable outcome. In fact, it converges fairly quickly in time that we sort of eyeballing it. It seems to be quadratic in the number of players, right? So theoretically, we couldn't establish it. So we tried to ask this question whether this holds for like some natural initial partition. So would we always converge to an IS outcome if we start with all players being singletons, or if we start with all players being in the grand collision? I mean, obviously, for some initial partition, we'll always get convergence. If we start from the initial partition that already is individually stable and we know it exists, if we start from there, we'll necessarily converge. So the way we should be asking this question is, are we guaranteed to converge to an individually stable outcome if we start from a natural initial partition, such as all singletons or the grand collision? And again, we don't know the answer. Right? So by the way, the same question of a single-peaked anonymous games, right, where individually stable outcomes are guaranteed to exist, does best response dynamics converge there? Again, the answer is not no. And again, I think it's a really nice open problem for those who are interested in exploring game dynamics. Okay, but now, so since we started exploring this question empirically, so Niclas set up a simulation. So we decided that if we're doing things empirically, we can also look at the quality of outcomes that are produced by different algorithms. So here's what we did. So we wanted to compare the algorithm that Niclas came up with for finding individually stable outcomes, the algorithm for individually stable outcomes with single peak preference from the original paper with Robert and Tayomi, and also what the outcome that is produced by best response dynamics. Okay, now, how can we compare them fairly? So, well, Niclas's algorithm works for any hedonic diversity game with two types, so all of this is actually with two types. Best response dynamics is well defined for any hedonic diversity game with two types. So for the algorithm from the first paper, well, that algorithm is only defined for single peak preference, right? The way it operates, it takes the single peak preference into consideration, right? So to compare them fairly, we had to look at games with single peak preferences. So we considered 3 different ways of generating single peak preferences, right? So they correspond to 3 different types of lines here. So we have, well, uniform single peak, symmetric single peak. Let me not get into details of what they are, but they're basically different probabilistic ways of generating single peak preference. Right? And they correspond to 3 different types of lines in the graph. Right? And we implemented all 3 algorithms, and we looked at agents' happiness, agents' collective happiness, properly defined. Again, let me not go into detail under all 3 algorithms. Right? And the interesting result here was that this actually vindicates our original algorithm, at least for some ways of generating the single peak preferences. Okay, so you can see that for this USP line, actually all algorithms work quite well and generate kind of total happiness that kind of is approaching the maximum possible. Right, so all 3 algorithms are equally good. But for the other 2 ways of generating single peak preference that are also fairly natural, the green line is above the other 2 lines, right? And the green line corresponds to the algorithm from the paper of Hedonic, Elkind, Igarashi, so the original paper, the algorithm for single peak preferences. So the specialized algorithm for single peak preferences actually results in happy agents, right? So this more complicated algorithm still has some value if we care not just in getting outcomes that are stable, but also in outcomes that keep agents happy. Right? right? And interestingly, even the best response dynamics actually produced better results than the simple algorithms that I showed you, right? You can see that the red line is above the blue line, right? So the blue line has the advantage of being very simple, but it forms this collision structure that are like one humongous collision, you know, the one that starts evenly balanced, but then may grow to be slightly less balanced and a bunch of singletons, right? And it seems like this overall structure, one huge collision and a lot of singletons, is just generally not very conducive for agents' happiness, right? And the other approaches kind of result in happy agents overall. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say about my original model, kind of the original model of hedonic diversity games. Now let me present you a variant of this model, which differs from the original model in that the collision sizes are fixed. Okay, so the way I would like to describe it is as a conference dinner problem. So I hope you still remember those times where we had actual in-person conferences with actual in-person talks, not by Zoom. I realize it must be a distant memory by now, but I think I've been to one as recently as this February, right? So I still kind of remember what this looked like. Okay, so these events tend to have this weird, quaint thing called conference dinners, right? And the way conference dinners are usually set up is that there are tables of usually the same size, right? And sometimes, especially if your conference is in Europe, right, there might be some wine served with dinner. So I don't know if they do that in Bergen, Norway, because, you know, I know what alcohol prices are there, but certainly in Southern Europe they do. Okay, so suppose you're at one of those conferences that have a conference dinner that provides alcohol, right? And now it's natural to classify your conference participants into two types, again, diversity games, with respect to their preferences with alcohol. Okay, so I'm very pleased to see Fedor's comment, right? So they can, very good to know. Okay, so let's say we have two players types. So players are drinkers and non-drinkers, right? And here's how express their preferences. So here we have a non-drinker, player A, and this player says, well, I just don't want any alcohol at my table, right? I'd rather be at a table where these bottles remain unopened, right? So I just have this moral objection to alcohol, each their own, right? So here's another player who doesn't drink, but finds drinkers amusing, right? So people tend to talk more, they're better company. So player B actually prefers to be at a table with a higher proportion of drinkers. Player C is a drinker, and as a drinker, she says, well, I feel weird on non-drinkers. I don't want to be like in a tiny minority at my table who drink alcohol, right? But you can also have a player who is a drinker, whose reasoning is completely different. So he says, the fewer people drink, the more alcohol will be left for me, right? Because there's a fixed amount of alcohol to be shared around the table. But at the same time, I don't want to drink alone. So I want to be at a table where people drink, where few people drink, but there are some non-drinkers besides me. Right? So it's kind of basically the same setting of diversity games. So we have two types, drinkers and non-drinkers. So they form collisions. So what is the main difference? So the main difference is that the collision sizes are fixed, right? So I can't do, for instance, what I did in my algorithm for individual stability, for one humongous collision and a bunch of singletons. All of my collisions have to be of size 6. Right? So this is what is known in the collision formation literature as the roommate problem, right? Because we think of these potential collisions as rooms. Each room is a dorm room with a fixed number of beds, and people have to be assigned to these dorm rooms. Right? So think of it as university students, say freshmen and sophomore, have to live in shared rooms, right? And each student has a preference over proportion of kind of freshman students and sophomore students in their room. Okay. So multi-dimensional, okay, so this is called multi-dimensional roommate problem. So we have K rooms of size S each, right? So we have KS agents who need to be assigned to rooms. So multi-dimensional because the size S can be large number, right? So usual kind of the standard version of roommate problem is rooms of size 2, S equals to 2, right? And here we are going for S potentially beyond 2. Right? And the question is kind of the same. Can we find a stable outcome? So the notion of stability is slightly different in this setting. So you can kind of still talk about core stability, right? So can a group of people kind of break away from the table they have been assigned and occupy an empty table in the corner of the room, right? If there are no empty tables, then a natural notion of stability would be swap stability. Can two people at different tables change their places? So you can also ask about Pareto optimality. So it's not so much a notion of stability, but really a notion of optimality. So can we arrange players so that it's impossible to rearrange them, making all players at least well off and some player better off. Right, so we want to have an outcome that is Pareto optimal that cannot be improved in this fashion. Right, so these are all natural questions. And in our work, so this is a paper that was recently accepted to ICHKAI and also appeared as a short paper in AMAS. So Niclas gave a very nice talk, which you can see as an AMAS recording. So I won't repeat Niclas's talk, but let me just briefly say what we have there. So we have guarantee of existence of good outcomes for S equals 2, which is in contrast of the general setting with roommate problems, where kind of if you just have general preference over roommates, you're not guaranteed that good outcomes exist for rooms of size 2. Right, and also we have algorithmic results, and this time we have fixed parameter tractability with respect to S for most of these problems. To me, they're not entirely satisfactory because they're algorithmic results that arise by formulating the problem as an integer linear program with a number of variables that is polynomial in S, and then throwing, Lenstra and Lenstra result at it. Right, so I'd be interested to know if there exists something more combinatorial. And for one of the settings we consider, and the special case of that setting, that we do have a combinatorial algorithm, but for most of them we already have this ILP-based algorithm. So I think this is also something that people from the parameterized complexity community can help us improve. Right, and again, kind of various kind of special cases of this model, kind of these. Okay, so mostly what we have here is hardness results, so there's still some possibilities for kind of identifying interesting special cases. Okay, so let me stop here and taking more. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover, so I'd be happy to take more questions. And as I already mentioned, so there's Niclas's talk online about this work, kind of as an kind of AMAS talk, so you're welcome to go see that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Edith. Yes, questions?
Okay, let me stop sharing my screen so I can see some faces. Okay, questions, complaints, suggestions. Okay, is there a notion of single crossing preference in this setting? Thanks, that's a great question. This is something that we try to think about. Right, so single crossing preferences would be, you'd have to order the agents so that, okay, so in principle, I don't see why not, right? So you would have to, okay, so we are talking about agents, like in regular voting setting, we are talking about agents who have preferences over alternatives that are ratios, right? So you can say that agents are ordered left to right, kind of each agent orders their potential ratios, right? And this profile of preference over ratios is single crossing. Yes, that's a meaningful concept. So I think the next question then, especially seeing who it comes from, is whether we can get any positive results for that setting. And the answer would be no, we haven't looked at that, right? So that's certainly a reasonable direction for future work. Thanks.
Yeah. Doesn't look that there are any more questions. So then, thank you once again. It was a great pleasure. And
yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes, and see you someday at some real conference with real wine, hopefully.
Yeah, cheers to that.
Okay, bye.